I wish I could say that when I became a priest or made a definite decision to follow the Lord, that my life got easier and that temptation was scattered far from me. But I think it was the opposite. I think as soon as I decided, you know what, Lord, I want to give you my whole life. I want to put my life at the service of your gospel. I want to give you everything. That's when the temptation really ramped up. Because what I said to the Lord is, I want to live for your mission. I want to live that my life could honor you. And what that does to me, and what that does actually to any of us that decide to go on the mission of the Lord, is it puts a big old target on our backs, and we become the ones who are attacked more. Because the devil really doesn't care too much about the people who are lukewarm. He doesn't care really much about the people who are far from the Lord, because he's already has them in his grasp. But the people who say that I'm determined to do the will of the Father, I'm determined to follow to the best of my ability God's call in my life, those become the targets. And maybe you experience that in your own life as a Christian. Is like, sometimes, Lord, I tell him, sometimes it's hard to keep your friends when you kind of allow the temptation to increase when we decide to follow you, right? Has anyone ever felt that way here? And we get kind of frustrated in the spiritual life. But I think that this is what the Lord is showing us in today's gospel, that when we're resolutely determined to do the will of the Father, the evil one's going to come after us. Because this is the one thing that the devil doesn't want us to do, is the will of the Father. And he's going to try anything to get under that and in between that mission in our lives. But today the Lord gives us tools. The Lord invites us into the desert. I think sometimes we can feel like the deserts of our lives are punishments from God. Somehow he takes us out into the desert to withdraw his presence from us. But in fact, the desert is not a place where he does that. The desert is a place that he strips us of all that is unnecessary. The desert is a place that he awakens in us this deep sense of need for him. The desert is a place where we get in tune with the things that keep us far away from him. And maybe during the ordinary times of the rest of our year and the rest of our lives, we can kind of get used to sin. We can kind of get used to these kind of daily struggles that we have. But Lent is these 40 days where we stop, where we invite the Spirit to lead us into the desert and to lead us into a deeper reliance upon God, to acknowledge the temptations of our life, to acknowledge our sin, to acknowledge our need for God, and to tell him, Lord, I can't sustain myself in this desert, so teach me how to trust in you. Teach me how to resist these temptations, Lord. And I think the Lord, he was never going to fall into these temptations, but the devil tried his darndest, right? He hits him right where it hurts. And I love the way that our gospel is written today. It says to us, he was led into the desert and he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and he was what? Hungry. He hits him very first in his human need. And that's the very first temptation, isn't it? He was hungry, so therefore what? Turn these stones into food. Turn them into bread. And I think all of us are first tempted in this way as well. We're first hit with those most base needs and base desires of our life. You're hungry for that. You're hungry for love. You're hungry for acknowledgement. Try this. It'll satisfy you. And many times we fall for that, right? Many times we look at that and you say, maybe they're right. Maybe I will be satisfied by these things. And I know for me, I return to certain things in my life over and over again because I fall for that same lie that somehow it's going to fulfill that hunger. Somehow that I'm going to be satisfied by taking a bite of that thing I know I'm not supposed to be taking a bite of. But the Lord responds differently. He acknowledges first this temptation, but then he responds to it with a higher truth. Man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes forth from the mouth of God. And this is how the Lord wants us to respond to temptation in our own life. I know often in my own life, when I get temptation, I try to first, what do I try to do? Try to ignore it, right? Like, nah, this is not here again, the same temptation again, rearing its head in a different way. I first try to ignore it, and then after I can't ignore it for a while, I start to battle that temptation. And needless to say, who always wins in the battle against temptation? It's not me. I normally fall into the reality of committing that sin again. The Lord tells us this is not the way to confront temptation and sin in our lives. He says, follow my example, follow my pattern. And so we see the Lord in our gospel today. He first acknowledges it. He doesn't try to ignore it. He knows exactly what it is. He acknowledges that temptation to turn those stones into bread. And then he responds with the word of God. He responds with that higher truth. And he confronts the devil with a strength that is not his own, but the strength that comes from the Father. And you see this in every single temptation that he confronts today. But then the third part of this that happens at the very end of our gospel is that he allows the angels to minister to him. He goes and connects with the Father. And oftentimes in our own fight against sin, our own fight against temptation, we end up just trying to do it ourselves, and we don't really call upon the Lord. We don't beg the Lord to send his angels, to send our guardian angels and the angels St. Michael and Raphael and Gabriel to come to our aid and to protect us, to minister to us, to help us in this struggle against sin. And in the spiritual life, when the devil can't get us on those base desires, those things like food and our kind of passions and those kind of things, then he levels it up, just like he leveled it up with Jesus today. And the next thing comes in and says, you know what? I want to make you the master of your own life, that you can make a decision to have life or to give it away. And kind of levels it up to Jesus. And Jesus again responds in that same way. And I think this is the kind of progression of temptation and sin in our life, that if it can't get us on lower levels, he's going to raise the bar, right? Starting to ask this question, who's the master of your life? And then that final temptation, this is the ringer, and hopefully none of us get to this place in our own life. If we do, ask yourself some serious spiritual questions about where you're at. The last one is a temptation to become God. Not just to take a mastership of your own life, but take a mastership over others. Become the person who decides what is good and evil, the person who decides to have control and take authority over others that doesn't belong to us. This last temptation is a temptation of power. It's a temptation not to follow the mission anymore, but to go and to forge our own mission and do our own thing. And we can kind of see in people's lives as we drift farther away from our reliance with God, how these temptations become very real. We can see with the people who have fallen very far away from God's grace in the history of humanity, that that's kind of the progression of how that went as well in their own lives and in ours as well. But the Lord invites us to reflect today on the reality of our need for him to keep us away from that. Because without him, we can't resist any of those temptations. Without him, we're going to fall into that and be drawn down that hill. Because that's what happened to our first parents, didn't it? And Adam and Eve in the garden, huh? They were people who were led by a lie. And we are people often led by a lie. But Lent is given to us as a time to rid us of this lie and to reroot us in this reality of who Jesus is and who he wants to be in our life. That he wants to free us from that so that we can worship him truly in spirit and truth. I love this story with Eve there and the snake, huh? Because guess what? This is not a story about Adam and Eve. This is a story about us. Each one of us is in that same place. And I think we forget that God said to them, you can eat of any tree. Any tree. There was probably thousands of trees in the garden, right? It was lush. It was a gift. You can eat of any of the trees except for this one tree. But so much in our lives, we get so fixated on that one tree, huh? I know I work with teenagers every day, and I tell them, if you can't do that one thing, guess what the one thing they want to do, right? That one thing. And that's our humanity, right? We kind of have this sneaking suspicion in the back of our hearts. Even though God says to us, you can have everything, and I want you to have life and life to the fullest. You can have it all except for that one thing. And the one question that pops up in our heart is, what is he holding from us? What can't I have? Rather than acknowledging all of the stuff that he wants to give us. And isn't that the place where that evil serpent goes and hits first? Did God really tell you, what did he say? Not that you couldn't eat of that one tree, but what? That you couldn't eat of any of the trees? He sows the seed of distrust. And before we fall into any temptation in our life, we always have to first sow the seed of distrust in our heart. We have to believe that God maybe, possibly doesn't really want what's good for us. That possibly, maybe God does just want to withhold something from us. Maybe we don't have a God who cares for his people. And maybe I have to take care of myself. And this is always the preemptive piece of falling into sin, is that we trust that we have a God who doesn't care for his people. And once that little wedge gets put in there by the snake, anything is possible, huh? Because then we take the power and authority into our own hands. And we say, if God the Father is not going to take care of me, then I'm going to take care of myself. And that's when the original sin happens, huh? It's an original sin of distrust more than it is of disobedience, because that's what comes first. Today, as we are driven into the desert, I invite us to just get honest with where this happens in our own life, because none of us, including me, are free from temptation and sin in our lives. But that we have a God who doesn't want you to make that battle on your own. And in fact, he knows that you can't battle this on your own. But when we get honest, when we acknowledge what it is, when we respond with the gift of his word that he's given us, and when we fly unto the protection of God, that any of these temptations that we suffer will be driven far away from us.